Well, good evening, my friends. Thank you so much for being here with me tonight as we take a look at supernatural Norfolk, one of the world's most reportedly haunted regions. So, tonight we're taking a little armchair tour through literally one of the most supernatural areas on Earth. And I'm really excited to share these locations with you. I did get a chance to visit some of these locations a few years back when I visited England on two occasions with my friend and colleague, Chris Halton, who some of you may know. Chris is the host of Haunted Earth Television here on YouTube. So I hope you will go and check out his channel. You can find the documentary that we filmed together over the course of several months in England. It's called The Haunting of M.R. James. And if you're a ghost story fan, you'll recognize the name M.R. James as one of the greatest ghost story writers who's ever lived. He was an Englishman and he wrote some of the most wonderful ghost stories, some of them that I've actually read here on the channel. So I hope you maybe check those out too. I think I read A Warning to the Curious, my all-time favorite ghost story. So that's you'll find that on the channel here. But Norfolk was so interesting, so beautiful, so diverse in all of the environments that we traveled through. And the age of so many places there is just hard for us as Americans to wrap our heads around. So it was really eye-opening for me. Even being from somewhere like Chicago, where we have buildings from the late 1800s, and we're like, whoa, those are so old. And, you go to places in England and there's places dating back to the 12th century, 11th century. It's really cool. But tonight we're going to take a little trip to some of the most reportedly haunted of these many intriguing places around the nation of England. And I think you'll find that there's some of the most classic ghost stories. And we're going to be talking about, among other things, among other ghosts, the so-called Brown Lady of Random Hall, which is the subject of our Pray for Ghosts blog this month at worldofthesupernatural.com. And it's definitely one of the most famous ghost stories of all time because of the infamous photograph that was taken of this alleged ghost many years ago now. And we're going to check all of that out tonight. So without further ado, let's jump in to supernatural Norfolk. And our first location tonight is a place in Norfolk that is extremely famous and extremely historic. It's Norwich Castle, and it's an ancient monument that dates back to its founding by William the Conqueror during the after the Norman invasion. Today, it's, as you can imagine, one of the most historic properties in England, with so many visitors that come there each year. There's also a museum on the property, and it's a local heritage site. So this is comparable to, like a national park in the United States, where many, many people come to visit each year. As you can imagine, this place has quite a few ghost stories. But they're not, as old as you would think that they would be. They actually only date back to the early part of the 19th century, and specifically to 1820, when there were some prisoners that were being kept inside the castle, who claimed that they witnessed the apparition of a woman dressed all in black and with a black veil over her face. This apparition, which was first reported back then in 1820, is still seen today by staff members and also by visitors to the location. Something like extra creepy about this apparition is that she seems to be floating and will actually float up in the air, like through the rooms. Kind of reminds me, if you guys saw Hereditary, of like how the mom was kind of floating through the house, through the air at the end of the movie. Really, really creepy. However, this apparition is not actually the scariest thing at Norfolk Castle. There's actually been an apparition also seen there over the years. That's the apparition of a rebel leader named Robert Kett. But it's not actually him, his spirit that's seen. It's the spirit of his corpse, his rotting corpse. And, it's interesting. You look at a lot of the ghost stories at these ancient sites, there's a lot of this gruesomeness and grisliness about the apparitions, so they're not like, dashing apparitions. A lot of times they're corpses, skeletons, skulls, headless people carrying their heads. We're going to see a lot of this evening. So definitely a cool place. I did not get a chance to visit Norfolk Castle when I was there with Chris Halton a few years ago, but I'm definitely going to go back here when I return. Looks like a really fascinating place. This is a place called Blickling Hall, another extremely historic site in Norfolk. This was the home of Sir Thomas Boleyn and his family, which included, of course, Anne Boleyn, who was actually born in this house. This estate is huge. It's over 4,000 acres in size. And Anne Boleyn, as you know, after she had her head chopped off by her husband, Henry VIII, became one of the many spirits in this manor house. She is one of the world's great white lady spirits, or white lady ghosts, and she's been seen dressed in the snow white gown, walking through the halls of Blickling and carrying her head under her arm. She's been seen like this at the Tower of London and a lot of places like this. But weirdest of all is not just people seeing the spirit of Anne Boleyn walking the halls of Blickling Hall, but she's actually known to leave the house from time to time. So she will travel around the countryside, and she goes in this ghostly carriage that's led by a team of headless horses, not making this up, and driven by a headless coachman. So not only does Anne Boleyn's ghost not have a head, her coachman and her horses don't have heads either. So can you imagine just, kind of taking a stroll around the area at night and coming across this crazy apparition of Anne Boleyn being driven by a headless horse, headless carriage driver and a team of headless horses. Believe it or not, Anne's father, Thomas, also haunts the castle. He was, I don't know if you know this, I didn't know this, I just found it out. He was also beheaded, and he too walks the Blickling Hall with Anne, also with his head under his arm. But his apparition, unlike Anne's also is known to breathe fire. So his head tucked under his arm has been known to breathe fire at people that witness it. Pretty intense. I am missing a slide here, so I'm going to move on. That was something that I just deleted. So we're going to move on to, of course, the great Norwich Cathedral. Norwich Cathedral is so incredible to see when you come to Norwich, which is, the center of the whole region. And it's kind of all of these places that we're talking about sort of span out from Norwich at the center, like spokes of a wheel. You can like draw lines from Norwich to each of these locations we're talking about. And the cathedral is just so imposing and incredible to look at. And as you can imagine, there's so many ghost stories at Norwich Cathedral. And there's been a couple of fascinating paranormal or seemingly paranormal photographs that have been taken in Norwich Cathedral and in the cloisters of Norwich Cathedral. So I want to show you those really quickly. This is a photo that was taken just a few years ago. I think it was in 2017 by a woman that was visiting the cathedral with her husband and her children. And she happened to take this photograph among the many that she took that day while they were visiting the cathedral. And she has come to believe that this is an apparition of one of the bishops that is buried, under the floors of the cathedral. She, took this picture of this, what appears to be a figure with a long white robe of some sort or vestments, and this tall hat on its head. Now, could this have been another figure? Of course, just someone flitting about up there, very much flesh and blood, perhaps, but this was not the only ghostly photograph that was taken here at Norwich Cathedral. The cathedral has the second largest cloisters in England. This, connects the cathedral to the various buildings where monks lived for, many hundreds of years and worked also on the property. It was finished in 1016. And it's a place where so many people have come to pray and visit and just marvel at the beauty of the architecture and the peacefulness of the area over the years. But there was a woman that visited here when she was going to school, and she was doing an art project. And she was taking many pictures around the cloisters when there was nobody around. And lo and behold, when she had some of these photographs developed, this was before digital cameras, she found that one of the photos in the cloisters had not one, but two apparently ghostly figures. You can see this one in the foreground, a white figure that looks like it's maybe even leaning over there. And then very kind of more frighteningly, this tall figure of what certainly looks to be a monk with the long robe and sort of the peaked hood there going through the cloister doors. So a couple of interesting photographs, definitely for sure, taken there, and not too far away years. So we'll be anxious to see if there's some more photos that come to light in future days. Now, this was a really cool place that we got to visit when we visited Norwich Cathedral. This is the Adam and Eve pub. It's a really popular pub that's right next to Norwich Cathedral. And it's claimed to be the oldest in the city, going back to 1249, when you could come here and get a drink. I think there were that the monks had a kind of like a still on this area, or a well that they would use to brew beer at that time. But there have been a lot of truly frightening apparitions that have been reported here. There was a great hospital nearby here, and some people believe that a lot of the apparitions might come from that. Not too sure. There was the first time that a bar was actually installed here was in 1971. So it is, as a actual bar, it's relatively recent, but there has been alcohol made here for much longer than that. So this building that you see here on the screen dates to the 17th century, and it was constructed of brick and flint with some other additions later. And there was still a well beneath the floor, which was used for the beer brewing and such. If you're at all familiar with paranormal activity, a lot of times paranormal investigators guess that running water, flowing water, can act as sort of like a conduit for paranormal manifestations. It's almost like a battery or something like that. Water being a great conduit for electricity, it makes sense, right? I mean, it's a theory, but it's always seemed like a good theory to me, and always one that I've shared. Now, the hauntings here are linked to a guy named Lord Sheffield, and he was killed close to the pub by rebels during Kett's Rebellion back in 1549, and it's still said that his spirit roams the pub and will ring a bell in the pub from time to time. There's also been reports around the pub of cold spots that come and go. This is another thing that can alert us to the possibility of spirits kind of absorbing all of the heat from the area. And people have also talked about hearing footsteps around the building, and also tapping on these picnic tables that are set up outside. And a lot of people indoors have said that their arms and their shoulders have been brushed by unseen hands. All of these sort of classic ghostly manifestations. What is not classic, however, is something that happened to one patron in 2006, when he claimed that he saw an apparition of a ghostly hand holding a severed head. Told you, a lot of gruesome ghost stories we're hearing about tonight. So that's the Adam and Eve pub, and that's right next to Norwich Cathedral in Norwich. Well, this is a very old property in Norfolk, and it was originally called the Skull Inn, or was the Skull Inn when it operated as a hotel. And today it's run by a company called Verb. And the little town here is called Dis. So now it's called Dis by Verb. But this is an old inn. And all the way back in 1759, it was the site of a gruesome murder when a woman allegedly named Emma was killed by her jealous husband. And Emma's ghost has been said to wander around these premises, again, not looking beautiful and ghostly, but actually dripping blood, which is reported to actually stain the bedclothes and the carpets, and then the blood just vanishes and it's like it never happened. This property, as you can imagine, is a place that attracts a lot of ghost hunters, and it also attracts a lot of people that are just traveling through this beautiful area. And it's said that very typically people will request either they'll say, I want to stay at the haunted part, or I definitely don't want to stay at the haunted part. So they'll book rooms based on whether they want to see the ghost or not. Also in the town, the village of Skull, is this little farmhouse. And this was the location of a famous, now infamous, series of seances that went on for years that have become known as the Skull experiments or the afterlife experiments. And they all took place in the basement room of this farmhouse that became known as the Skull Hole. And it's this little room that was set up as essentially a seance circle by a man named Robin Foy and his wife Sandra. And basically the Foys wanted to bring back what we call physical mediumship. So this is not mediumship where you'll have a psychic medium who's, going into a trance and giving messages from the beyond, allegedly. Physical mediumship is where you have actual objects that are moving around, like the table tipping. Objects will move around the room. Objects will materialize. There'll be disembodied sounds and things like that. So they wanted to sort of save this practice of physical mediumship that had been going out of style since it had this big boom back starting in the 1840s, 50s with the advent of the spiritualist movement. So there had been many physical mediums around, throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But then, as physical mediumship fell out of popularity, it really seemed like this was going to disappear altogether. So they wanted to make sure that the practice of physical mediumship did not disappear. So they decided they were going to start a seance circle, a spiritualist circle, and start to try and manifest physical objects, physical movements, and visible apparitions of every kind, physical, visual apparitions, auditory apparitions, and so forth. So the couple held seances on their own beginning in 1990, but they didn't have much success until they brought a group of 7 people together, including themselves, and started holding these seance sittings in 1993. And in the first 2 years, the group had so much success with these regular sittings that they felt comfortable actually inviting other people to observe them. And it's really weird because during this period where they were having some people over, they were charging for this. They charged £50 a person back in the 1990s for the privilege of sitting in on one of these seances. And they had a lot of members of the prestigious Society for Psychical Research come in and observe. And a lot of those observers believed that this was the real thing. And these skull experiments had actually produced evidence of life after death. A lot of the other members of the society were not so convinced. And many people believed that this was fraudulent, or it was some sort of like thought form manifestations or something also intriguing, but not proof of life after death. I also discovered recently, because as you probably know, I'm doing a lot of research on UFOs right now. I discovered that members of the American CIA and of NASA actually sat in on some of the skull experiment sittings. And then these members of NASA returned here to the United States and set up their own group to contact spirits. During these seances at Skoll in England, when NASA was there, the members of NASA were there. Allegedly, this one spirit that was kind of the ringleader of the spirits in the Skoll experiments claimed that he had given information to the CIA in America when the CIA was holding spiritualist seances in 1952, which I believe he said was attached to exploration of the UFO phenomena, which totally blew my mind because there is a lot of occult activity that's been revealed to have been a part of the UFO phenomena starting back in the 1940s. So more on that later, but it's pretty weird. Anyway, the stuff that happened in the Skull Hole was very extensive. There were a lot of things that supposedly this group produced, including a lot of strange photos and videos that seemed to show human faces and figures, and then later alien type figures, like alien space being type figures. There were also dozens of reported apports of objects. That's when objects just appear from out of nowhere and they would drop onto the seance table and things like that. Spoons, knives, a lot of jewelry, gems, crystals, things like that. And there were also materializations of objects such as newspapers that were in perfect condition from, 50, 60 years prior. Another big part of the Skull experiments and a piece of the evidence that the group put forward were these film canisters that they would have blank film that hadn't been used yet. If you remember the days of old 35 millimeter film. So they would have sealed canisters of film, and they would, or packages of film that they would put in this locked box in the middle of the seance table. And then after the sitting, they would open up the box, and they claimed that they would find imprinted on the film strange scrawling messages in all different foreign languages, autographs, signatures of supposedly, famous people like Thomas Edison, famous scientists like that they would, have experts compare the signatures. And oftentimes it seemed like they matched. So a lot of strange things like that. They also, and this is similar to something that's happened in a lot of these different sorts of experiments where people are trying to communicate with the dead using different modern methods. The spirit beings on the other side were giving instructions to the group on equipment to build to make the transmissions of messages clearer and more frequent. So it's definitely an interesting story. There were a lot of light effects that went on. They had full body apparitions that happened. There was music, bells ringing, and they captured a lot of this stuff on video as well. So there's some documentaries out there about the Skull experiment. There was a huge long article that the Society for Psychical Research wrote to report on this. But again, in the end, still up in the air about whether or not this was legitimate phenomena that was produced, if it was a giant fraud, if it was a mixture of things, or really, who knows? So I'll probably do a whole lecture later on this year about the Skull experiment and go into more detail about this, but we couldn't talk about haunted Norfolk without talking about the Skull experiment. So, okay, moving on. This is a story that I just found out recently about, and it's a really kind of a sad little story. And it seems maybe like it's more folklore than really based on a true story, but it's definitely a chilling story. And it's the story of Lord George Dacre, who was the 5th Baron of Dacre, who said to have been murdered at Thetford in Norfolk at the age of just 8 years old. And it's said in the region still today that his murder was part of a plot that was cooked up by his guardian, a guy named Sir Richard Fulmerston, in 1569. And this was related to some kind of a land grab associated with the will. So apparently this nasty uncle was trying to get this little boy's inheritance away from him. So according to the story, at the age of 7, this little boy fell off of a rocking horse that had been jimmied by his nasty uncle so that it would malfunction. And I guess this rocking horse did malfunction so badly that this little boy fell off of it and died of his injuries. So after his own death, a few years later, it's said that Sir Richard, who apparently had been damned, was wandering the earth, and part of his sentence was to haunt this site where the little boy died, which was the area that you see here. This is called Nuns Bridges in Thetford. And they say that you can see this little boy riding a headless, once again, rocking horse across the bridge. Now, according to the story, the little boy ghost was so annoying to people that lived in the little cottages and such in this area that they tried to banish the ghost by putting a big box of candles in the little boy's old bedroom. And they told the ghost that it could not come back anymore until all the candles were burnt up. And assumingly they didn't put any matches in the room. And according to the story, that actually stopped the ghost of the little boy from appearing. Well, sadly, this, exciting story, or probably it's for the best, an historian recently discovered that this, notorious Sir Richard actually died several years before little Lord Dacre. So it's not possible that he was instrumental in the little boy's death, but it's still a good story. I think you'll agree. Well, this is such a famous place for ghost hunters to go. And this is the old Thetford Warren Lodge. This was built sometime in the 1400s and can be found just a few miles west of the village of Thetford. Now, at one time, there was a medieval leper colony in this area, and one of the most famous ghosts of Thetford Warren Lodge is the ghost of allegedly a leper who was confined to the lodge because of his illness. People who encounter the phantom of this dead leper say that he actually has no face when you see him. So really creepy and terrifying apparition. There's also, strangely enough, Warren, as you may know, is it was associated with rabbit hunting, right? So apparently over the years, people have seen the ghost of a rabbit around the lodge with glowing red eyes, which has scared a lot of people, especially because according to the legend, if you see this demonic rabbit, it's a portent of your own death. Not too far from Thetford Warren Lodge is the Old Fatford Priory. This is an old monastery site. The monastery was founded by Roger Biogold, who was the first Earl of Norfolk in the early 12th century. So this goes back all the way to the 1100s. And buried here were many of the earls and dukes of Norfolk. This was also one of the last monasteries to surrender to Henry VIII in 1540. So it was one of the last holdouts of Roman Catholicism here in Norfolk, or up in England in general. The ruins here are very significant. A lot of these locations of ruins, there's only maybe one structure that's standing, barely distinguishable, but there's so many of so many portions of the old prior that are still standing here today. As you can see, the foundations, then some of the walls are still standing. The 14th century gatehouse is still here. The cloister is still here. The hauntings were reported here only started in 1932, and those first reports were of ethereal singing that was heard wafting from the ruins and around the surrounding countryside. 50 years after these first auditory apparitions were reported, there were other reports that came in from a guy named Christian Jensen Romer, which I'm here in the US, but apparently he's a well-known British paranormal investigator. And while he was investigating as a young man, he said he saw the figure of a monk descending a staircase here, but the staircase is no longer there. So that's pretty cool. He saw the monk walking down the staircase, but the stairs were no longer there. In 1992, some young people in the area, this of course is a place for young people to go ghost hunting, were exploring the remains of the priory and encountered an apparition of another one of the monks here. And they said that he was carrying an old iron ring of keys, and they could actually hear these old iron keys clanking together against the ring. So interesting to have that kind of a combination of, you don't often have that combination of a visual apparition with an auditory apparition. So pretty unique in the annals of ghost lore. This is an incredible place that I did get to visit when we were in Norfolk. Castle Rising, one of the most famous castles in the world, and also, as you can imagine, one of the most haunted. This castle has been standing since the 12th century, dating back as old as the Thetford Priory. And it's got one of the finest examples of a preserved keep in all of England. So really, as you can see here, very particularly intact historic site, ancient site. There's a lot of ghost stories here at Castle Rising, but the most famous ghost here is the ghost of Queen Isabella, known as the SheWolf of France. Right now, this is kind of a long story, so cuddle up. Queen Isabella was the youngest living child of King Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair. Isabella was revered for her beauty, intelligence, and charisma, and she arrived in England at the age of 12 to marry Edward II. Their marriage was infamous in the annals of English history, fraught with difficulty, because though Edward received a great deal of love from his young queen, he liked the boys. And so he was very close to his male friends, Piers Galveston, and later, very famously, Hugh Despenser the Younger, who was basically his lover. Isabella tried to love her husband despite his affections for other men, but eventually her efforts cooled off and she looked for affection elsewhere. She landed in the arms of Roger Mortimer, the first Earl of March, who had escaped to France after his unsuccessful revolt against Edward. Now, Edward, if he had been paying a little more attention, probably would have realized that rebellion against him was coming, but apparently he wasn't the sharpest crayon in the box. He had no intention of leaving his lover, Hugh, either, although Isabella pleaded with him to exile his boyfriend for the sake of the nation. Well, in 1326, Isabella and Roger Mortimer led a successful invasion of England, and Edward and Hugh tried to escape, and they left like thousands of pounds of cash behind and all of this treasure in the castle, but they made it only to Wales. I think they were trying to escape to Ireland. In Wales, they were chased through a Welsh rainstorm by dogs, literally hunted down. Edward was imprisoned and later forced to abdicate to his son. And in the following days, his lover, Hugh Despenser, was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Castle Rising, as Isabella reportedly enjoyed the show during dinner. Legend has it that her old husband was murdered by being sodomized with a red-hot poker. Now, her new husband, Roger Mortimer, Isabella's new husband, Roger Mortimer, governed until Edward III, Isabella's son, overthrew him in 1330, but he became known as a ruthless power grabber without seemingly any moral compass whatsoever. And so eventually he also was removed, so as we should say. Now, Elizabeth went on to be, they say she was imprisoned in Castle Rising until her death. But there's a lot of, kind of the jury is out on that. She really had free reign of the place. She had a very glamorous lifestyle there. She had a lot of big parties and things like that. But she did reportedly eventually go mad, and she died here insane. Locals still report that they will hear the shrieking of the mad Isabella just ringing across the countryside at night. And footsteps and apparitions of Isabella are seen in the White Room, which was her sewing room when she was alive. And a few years ago, these paranormal investigators from Essex spent the night at Castle Rising, and they set up cameras in Isabella's White Room, and they captured this figure on infrared camera that shows kind of looks like what looks like a figure with like a bowed head with these skirts, long skirts. Now, I don't know, maybe it needs a little bit of imagination and suggestion, but it's sort of interesting considering the things that people have heard and seen in this part of the castle. Well, now we move on to the star of the evening, though not the end of our program, the infamous location of Raynham Hall, the site of one of the most famous hauntings on earth, and the site where one of the most famous ghost photos of all time was taken. The story of a ghost at Raynham Hall began when a woman named Lucia Stone said that she had attended a Christmas party just before Christmas, one bone-chilling eve in the 1800s. And the guests that night were put up for the weekend in the house, and late into the evening, a Colonel Loftus, as she reported, and a friend of his named Hawkins claimed to see what they called a, quote, brown lady as they made their way to their rooms. They said the brown was in reference to a diaphanous but unmistakable brown brocade dress that the Phantom wore. The woman appeared to Loftus again the next night when he was alone, but this encounter was a little more upsetting because this time he saw the lady's face, and he said that the face bore empty eye sockets sunk into a luminous countenance. These encounters, again, happened just before Christmas at a Christmas party. And according to the story, a lot of the staff of Raynham Hall packed up and left right before Christmas, forcing the family to get their whole Christmas Day celebration and food and everything together by themselves without any staff. One of the most famous incidents that included the Brown Lady was the incident involving Captain Frederick Marryat, who was a close friend of Charles Dickens. And this happened in 1836. He actually came to Raynham Hall specifically because he had heard the ghost stories, and he believed that the ghost was not real, but that there were smugglers in the area that were trying to convince people that there were ghosts at Raynham Hall so that they would stay away and not discover the smuggling operation that was going on. And his daughter, Florence Marryat, wrote years later about what her father had experienced that night in Raynham Hall when he actually reportedly shot at the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall, and the gunshot holes remained in the walls and the doors for years afterwards. Well, you've probably seen by now the famous photograph of the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall that was taken in 1936 by a photographer, photojournalist for Country Life magazine, and his assistant, Indre Shira, who had traveled to Norfolk to conduct a photo shoot at Raynham Hall for the magazine's upcoming issue. That photograph has gone down in history as perhaps the most famous paranormal photograph of all time, and it has been disputed by so many skeptics and believers over the years, and it remains to this day highly controversial. Some people think it was a deliberate fraud. Some people think there was grease or something like that on the lens when the photograph was taken, and some people continue to believe that it is authentic. Everyone, however, continues to try and prove their Everyone, however, believes that if this is a ghost in this photograph, it is the ghost of a woman named Dorothy Walpole. She was, according to the story, the most desirable of the Walpole sisters. Robert Walpole was, for all practical purposes, the first prime minister of England. Charles Townshend, it's the Townshend family who's been at Raynham Hall for some 400 years. Charles Townshend wed Dorothy Walpole in 1713, but rumors still fly that she was involved in some hanky-panky with a guy named Lord Wharton. Now, Wharton had something of a reputation around the Raynham estates and beyond, and his friskiness was even worse because his wife just kind of turned a blind eye to it. Friends of Wharton commented that his behavior was so infamous and his lady's complacent subserviency so notorious that no young woman could spend 24 hours under their roof with safety to her reputation, end quote. Now, some say that Townshend was so enraged by Dorothys' affair that he locked her in her room at Raynham, and she never saw the light of day again. She reportedly died of smallpox and apparently soon began her ghostly rounds of her earthly prison. It's been many years since the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall has been seen there, but there are other estates where some believers claim that she has ventured out to, including Sandringham, where Queen Elizabeth II liked to spend a lot of time, including Christmases. So, is the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall still sort of alive and well in her ghostly form? Some claim that's exactly the case. Well, we do know that that photo continues to be known as one of the most, if not the most, infamous paranormal photographs ever taken. This is such a great place that I want to visit next time I head over to England. This is the Marlborough collection, and this is a collection of military artifacts, including planes and tanks and other artillery from wars throughout British history. I love these kinds of museums. I don't know if you guys have ever been to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. It is such an incredible place. And one of the coolest things about it is that it is staffed completely by veterans, including World War II veterans, some very elderly, and they're so nice and help show you around and everything. But so definitely go down to New Orleans if you're ever that way, but plan to spend the entire day there. It's a huge, huge place with a separate museum for the goal is to have a separate museum for every battle of World War II. An extensive project that's had a lot of work done already. So you can already spend probably 2 days there easily. So again, highly recommended. At any rate, the Marlborough collection is in Weyburn, and it's got some haunted pieces of artillery there. It's a place where visitors have reported hearing kind of sinister things like groans and screams, almost like victims of war. They also hear shouting in the halls, ghostly footsteps, banging of doors, the sort of poltergeist activity. And there's been, interestingly, too, spirit lights that have been seen near an old bunker outside of the museum. Some people think that these ghost lights are the ghostly energy of 6 young women of the Auxiliary Territorial Service. This is kind of the UK version of the US military reserves. So these ghost lights have been seen together, 6 of them, believed to be tied to the death of these 6 young women. One of the strangest reports at the collection is the report of a Russian T-34 tank that has been heard cooling down as if it was running, the ignition turned off, and that the sound is cooling, the tank is cooling down. And this is a sound that was instantly recognized by many visitors to the museum that have worked around these kinds of tanks when they were in the military. And they said the sound is unmistakable, even though the tank hasn't been turned on for decades. Oh, this was one of my favorite places that we visited when we were filming our documentary in England. The town of Cromer is right on the North Sea, and it's a holiday town, so it would be similar to like in the United States, like Myrtle Beach or something like that, where they've got like all of these attractions like arcades and shops, and they've got all kinds of you can get crab sandwiches. That's the big thing to eat there. So it's a holiday town. It's also a very old town, and there are so many ghost stories associated with Cromer, especially with its unmistakable pier that juts out into the North Sea. Locals believe that this pier is just filled with ghosts. And the most famous ghost has actually come to light in pretty recent years. The ghost of a woman they call Elizabeth, who was supposedly an actor that performed in the old auditorium in the pier. And according to the story, she was performing one night when there was a scene in the play where she was supposed to be killed on stage. And there was a prop knife, they say, that was accidentally replaced by, or maybe not so accidentally, replaced by a real knife. And the other actor who was working with Elizabeth accidentally stabbed her to death on stage. So they say that her ghost roams the pier. It's really, when I was writing this, I found it really disturbing. So very similar to the Alec Baldwin incident that happened recently in Hollywood. It's really a sad story. Now, I don't know if the story of Elizabeth is true. Apparently, this story only came to light during a ghost hunt that was held in, I think it was 2003, when the pier was about to be completely renovated and restored. And I don't know. I don't know if this Elizabeth character presented herself through like a ghost box or a medium or something like that, but there doesn't seem to be any real story to this. So it could just be, something that was imagined by the investigators, or maybe something demonic that was presented during the investigation through a ghost box or a medium or something like that. But at any rate, there were a lot of people that were working on the renovation, apparently, that said they had uneasy feelings during the renovation, which is something that, of course, we hear a lot of during renovations, right? Where the workers say that they feel like they are not wanted there, if they feel like something's trying to get them to leave, almost like the former inhabitants don't want the restorations to take place, right? Definitely a familiar story. There have been reports of singing heard in recent years, and some people believe that this is the singing of the spirit Elizabeth. Some people say that the sound of the singing at night mingles with another sound, the sound of the church bells of a town that was washed out to sea many, many years ago. That's a town known as Shipton. And for years, you could still see the church tower of Shipton, the waves crashing over it a little bit off the shore of Cromer, and they eventually blew it up because it was a hazard to ships that were in the area. But it's so tragic and spooky along the coast of the North Sea. In England, there are so many of these towns that washed out to sea years ago, also in the Dunwich area that we visited. And so there's a lot of these kinds of ghost stories along the shore of the North Sea in England, where people say that you can still hear the church bells ringing at night of these churches that are now long beneath the waves off of the current coastlines. This is such a creepy story in Cromer. If you go through England, almost every town has a church of Saints Peter and Paul, along with Cromer. And this is the church of Saints Peter and Paul, and the old churchyard there. There's a very famous resident of Cromer, Walter Rye, who wrote a history of Cromer in 1889. And he had a lot of pieces of folklore in that book. Thankfully, he saved a lot of the old folklore and ghost stories. He was mayor of Cromer for a while, and apparently he was descended from one of the area's founding families. He was the one who recorded the story of Shipton and the story of the ghostly church bells of Shipton. And in this same book, he recorded a story of apparently this happened to someone that he had hired to do some work at the church. I think he was actively working to restore the church that had fallen into neglect and disrepair. And Rye had was very actively involved in raising funds for it. I think he wrote this history to sell the book to raise funds to help to restore the church. And he said he hired someone to do some work on the tombstones, restoring the tombstones in the churchyard. And he said that this man that he had hired to clear away some of the rubbish was crossing the chancel at night. And he said, this man told him that, quote, a little childlike figure dressed in white arose from the ground within an arm's length of him and gradually increased in height till its face was level with his. And then all of a sudden, a great gash appeared across its throat. The blood poured down in a great torrent over its white clothes, and it vanished in a flash, leaving a sighing sound in his ears, end quote. So just like at that old Skull Inn, you have another ghost that's literally bleeding over the physical environment. So pretty gruesome. According to that, to Rye, he said that he had found in the local history that there was a little girl that was brutally murdered, that was buried there many years before. And he came to believe that this ghost that appeared to this caretaker or worker was the ghost of this poor little murder victim. Underneath Cromer are all of these old tunnels, and they were used by smugglers for many years in the olden days. And some people believe that the monks who lived in the area also used these tunnels as a chapel for worship. And so both the ghosts of smugglers and also Gregorian chant from the days that the monks were using the tunnels after the outlying of Catholicism in the area, both of these have been reported by tourists walking through the street over the years. Well, this is one of the just coolest places that you'll visit when you visit Norfolk. The Norfolk Broads is an area of Norfolk that's kind of this network of mostly navigable canals and rivers and lakes across the English countryside. And it's not only in Norfolk, it's also in Suffolk too, but it's known as the Norfolk Broads. So the Broads is an area that has so many of these old ancient areas, including a place called St. Bennett Monastery. And there's not too much left. This is very common, like I said, in these old ancient areas. There's not too much of the old monastery that's left. It's just the gatehouse that's still standing. A local farmer built a windmill out of these ruins in the 19th century. But definitely the folklore of the area is still here. They say that, let me go back to this one so you can see, this is the river Brewer that's right next to the monastery grounds, the old monastery grounds. And they say that at sundown, sometimes you can still see one of the little monks rowing his boat with his little dog by his side on the river. But that's a very pleasant story, but there's not a lot of other pleasant stories associated here. There's famously the story of the screaming monk of St. Bennett. And they say that so many people have seen this terrifying apparition or specter when they've been wandering around the grounds here at night, including one gentleman who apparently drowned in the nearby river when he saw the screaming monk and ran away so fast that he actually fell into the river and drowned. That's one of the local stories. Most fascinating of all is the story, however, of a dragon who terrorized the nearby town of Ludham and met its demise on the sacred grounds of the Abbey. Believe it or not, the story does not date back to medieval times, but to the 19th century. There was a local resident who was also a folklorist named William Henry Cook, and he collected a bunch of accounts, firsthand accounts of this reported incident, and he gave them to his friend Russell Coleman, incidentally one of the mustard family, Coleman mustard family, and and I guess they were found among Coleman's papers when he passed away. The Cook wrote an introduction, kind of a letter when he gave these stories to Coleman to introduce what they were about. And he said, quote, "Many years ago, the good people of Ludham were shocked by the appearance of a hideous monster. It was said to have resembled a dragon or a monstrous lizard. It was covered with scales and had wings. Its frightful mouth was rendered formidable by tremendous teeth. It was supposed to measure from 12 to 15 feet in length. It was only visible after sunset, and none dared to leave their houses when it was dark. The dragon, or monster, as some would call it, formed a large burrow, which was known to extend from the yard at the back of the local public house to just past the old schoolhouse. And every morning, the exit was filled up with bricks and stones in an effort by the villagers to keep the monster from emerging again. Just as often, it was reopened at night by this monster. Well, one bright sunshining afternoon, to the horror of the inhabitants, it was seen to leave the burrow. As soon as it had got some distance away, a courageous parishioner dropped a single large round stone into the mouth of the burrow, completely filling it up. After basking in the sun for some time, the monster returned. Not being able to remove the stone, it turned away, bellowing and lashing its sides furiously with its tail. It then made its way across the fields in the direction of the bishop's palace. Turning to the left, it made its way along the dreary causeway leading to the ruined St. Bennetts Abbey gateway. Round and round it ran, throwing up stones and dirt in its fury and raising its hideous form up against the ruined walls. At last, it entered the gloomy archway where it is supposed to have made its way to the vaults beneath and was no more seen. After a time, the burrow So I don't know what this was. Almost sounds to me like a gator got over there to Thetford in England, doesn't it? I don't know if we'll ever know what the dragon of St. Bennet's of what was, but it's definitely a fascinating story. I can't believe it dates back to only the 1800s. But here's another cool shot of the old not Thetford Priory, the old St. Benedict monastery grounds, Abbey grounds. All right. And last but not least, the Acle Strait is known as one of the most haunted roads in the world. This is part of the A47 road. And it's a bustling highway that links Norwich to the North Sea coast at Great Yarmouth. This is one of the great English seaside villages. But at night, so there's all of this holiday traffic on the road during the day, but at night it is avoided by people because it's known to be so haunted. I don't know if it's, the spookiness of the ghosts more that's so terrifying to people. And so, the people are really worried about it, or the fact that these ghosts walk right in front of your car. And I don't know if you've ever driven in England, people drive really fast. And so you're driving this remote road at night, and all of a sudden, these apparitions will walk right out in the road in front of you. And so people can't slam the brakes on in time. And oftentimes, or most often, the vehicle they're driving will go right through the apparitions. The typical apparition of that is that of an aging gentleman, so an older gentleman that walks across the path of these oncoming cars. And some people, when the car, goes through the apparition, even though the car coasts right through the figure, they actually will hear or feel an impact of a collision, but no body is ever found and no damage to the car is ever found. There are other drivers on the Acle Strait who have reported a ghostly horse and trap or cart behind it, which will also simply sort of appear in front of the road, in front of their their cars that are just clipping along happily on their way to the seaside, when this apparition will just walk right in front of the car. And this sometimes happens even in broad daylight and bright sunshine. Finally, along the road, and worst of all, people will sometimes encounter this vanishing hitchhiker, famous vanishing hitchhiker along the roadside, who will be walking along the side of the road, and then he'll turn towards the oncoming vehicle, and the drivers and passengers of the car will be horrified to see that this apparition has no face at all. All right, my friends. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed this look at supernatural Norfolk with me tonight, one of the most haunted regions of the world. This has been by far, this is not by far an exclusive look. This has not been by far an exclusive look at the ghosts and hauntings of Norfolk, but these are the most famous ghosts and hauntings of Norfolk, or at least most of them. I think not most of them. I really highly recommend that you check out Chris Halton's channel, Haunted Earth, where he visits a lot of the haunted locations in England, including Norfolk, so you can get a closer look at this. As mentioned, I think I'm going to take a longer look at the skull experiment later this year, so make sure that you sign up for these live stream lectures one of two ways. You can always see the recorded lecture later on my YouTube channel, Ursula Bielski's World of the Supernatural, where you're probably watching it right now. But in the future, you can attend the live stream lectures where we talk to each other. You can ask questions and make comments. And you can sign up for those either by buying a ticket on the website at worldofthesupernatural.com. And I usually do like an ad reminder, video reminder on YouTube when those are coming up. You can also become a supporter of mine on Patreon. And at the $15 level, you can get a monthly free pass for your entire household to attend the lectures, the live stream lectures. And I'll send you a recording of the lecture afterwards to keep that you can share with your family members. So either buy a ticket to future lectures and find out about them on the website at worldofsupernatural.com. That is not a ghost, it's my husband. Or become a Patreon supporter so you can join me every month for new lectures about haunted places all over the world and supernatural topics that I hope that you will enjoy. Thank you so much for being with me here tonight for this look at supernatural Norfolk. Please send me any questions that you have or drop them down in the comments. I'm at Ursula Bielski at sbcglobal.net. You can also contact me through the website, worldofthesupernatural.com. And I hope to see you next time. Until then, remember to pray for ghosts. I'm Ursula Bielski.